I woke up in my small apartment in Austin, Texas, the smell of rain lingering from the storm that had rolled through the night before. As I blinked myself awake, there was a nagging discomfort, an itch just beneath the skin. Groggy and disoriented, I swung my legs off the bed and shuffled to the bathroom, thinking it was probably just the effects of a few too many drinks from the night before. But when I flipped on the bathroom light, what I saw jolted every ounce of sleep from my body. There, etched into my forearms, were dark, sprawling symbols, swirling across my skin in an intricate, haunting pattern. The lines were inky black, landing up from my wrists to my elbows, twisting and curling like living vines. I reached up, barely daring to touch them, but the moment my fingers brushed my arm, I felt a cold shock that sent shivers down my spine. These markings weren't just on the surface. They were embedded, as if tattooed into the very layers of my skin. The markings looked aged, like they'd been there for weeks, yet they hadn't been there the day before. I was sure of it. A night of heavy drinking had its risks, but I wasn't the type to forget getting inked, especially with symbols as sinister as these. My mind raced, attempting to piece together fragments of the night. All I remembered was leaving the bar on 6th Street around midnight and walking home through the rain-soaked streets. A wave of nausea hit me as I glanced at the symbols again. They looked ancient, like something out of an old manuscript or some arcane ritual book. As I studied them more closely, a sense of dread washed over me. I could almost hear a whisper in the back of his mind, something murmuring just beneath my consciousness. But I shook my head, brushing it off his nerves. Still, I had to know. I tried scrubbing them off, even going so far as to use a scouring pad, but the marks remained, stubborn and unyielding. My skin grew red and raw, but the black lines held their ground. Frustrated, I splashed cold water on my face and stumbled back to my room, where I frantically searched my phone for any clue. There were no unusual messages or photos. But in my call history, I noticed a missed call around 3:30 a.m. from an unknown number. Strangely, there was no voicemail, just an empty notification. I felt a chill, a gnawing feeling since something was off. After calling out of work, I decided to start searching for answers. I threw on a long-sleeved shirt to cover the symbols and headed to the university library. The Texas sun was blazing down, almost too bright, and as I walked through the crowded streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. Every corner I turned, every window I passed, I felt the weight of unseen eyes tracking my every step. At the university, I pored over books on ancient symbols, occult practices, and folklore. But nothing came close to the symbols on my arms. I was nearly ready to give up when an old book caught my eye. The cover was worn and faded, the title barely legible. Esoteric Rituals of the Southwest. I flipped through the pages, and halfway through I froze. There, sketched in faded ink, was an illustration nearly identical to the symbols on my arms. The accompanying text was a grim tale about ancient rituals performed by forgotten sects, people who believed that symbols carved into flesh could act as beacons, drawing in dark forces. The account was chilling, detailing how these symbols supposedly connected a person to another realm, a shadowed world that lurked just beneath our own. And as I read, a phrase caught my eye. "Those marks shall be haunted by what lies beyond." The words rang in my mind, lingering as if echoing in some far-off cavern. I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling. It was irrational. This was just an old story, but the feeling gnawing at me felt all too real. Leaving the library, I felt an intense urge to get out of Austin away from these symbols. The idea was ridiculous, but the thought of staying any longer felt unbearable. I drove for hours, my destination unclear. I only knew that I wanted to be somewhere empty somewhere that didn't carry the weight of other people. Eventually, I found myself in Marfa, a small, desolate town known for its strange lights and eerie silence. By the time I arrived, dusk was settling and casting long shadows across the barren landscape. I checked into a rundown motel, hoping a night in solitude might help clear my mind. But as soon as I closed my eyes, the darkness came alive. The symbols on my arms began to burn in intense, searing pain that spread through my veins, reaching into my very bones. I threw off the covers and flicked on the lights, heart pounding. Then I saw it, a faint glow seeping through the window blinds. Hard hammering, I peeled the blinds open just a sliver. And there in the distance I saw them, strange, floating orbs of light. They danced and flickered, moving in unnatural patterns, hovering in the open desert beyond the town. My skin prickled with unease. These were the Marfa Lights, a local phenomenon, but they seemed different. As I watched, I felt a compulsion to go outside and follow them, as if some unseen force was pulling me into the night. Despite every instinct telling me to stay put, I found myself drawn toward the lights, compelled by an urge that felt alien. I left the motel, stumbling through the brush, the lights glowing brighter the closer I got. I felt as though the world was melting around me, the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurring, until they were indistinguishable. The lights continued to drift further, and I followed, tripping over rocks and stray branches, heedless of the pain. Finally, they led me to a clearing, surrounded by twisted, gnarled trees that looked as though they'd been burned and scarred by some ancient fire. In the middle of this desolate place was an old, decrepit altar. Stone and weathered it bore the same symbols that marked my skin, and a nauseating realization hit me. This altar, was connected to whatever was happening to me. Suddenly, I felt a presence, a heaviness pressing down on me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. A shadow detached itself from the surrounding darkness, shifting and morphing, until it took on a vaguely human shape. I wanted to run to scream, but I was paralyzed, locked in place as this thing circled me. The creature moved closer, and as it did, I could feel its gaze upon me, probing, digging into my mind. It reached out a hand, bony and clawed, and traced the symbols on my arm. I felt a cold, so intense it burned. The creature's touch was like frostbite, leaching warmth from my very soul. A voice cold and hollow echoed in my mind. "You are marked, a beacon to the realm beyond." Once called, there was no escape. It vanished then as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me alone in the darkness with the pulsing pain of the symbols etched into my skin. I stumbled back to the motel, collapsing on the bed, drenched in sweat and trembling with terror. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature, felt its presence lurking just beyond the edge of my mind. In the days that followed, I tried to return to normal life, but the symbols remained dark and unyielding. At night, the lights appeared outside my window, closer each time, their glow sickly and unnatural. I realized they were not just lights. They were eyes, watching, waiting for the moment to drag me fully into their world. As I sit here now penning these last words, I know I don't have much time left. The lights are here again, right outside my window, flickering and pulsing. The symbols on my arms are burning, searing into my flesh, as though demanding my surrender. If you're reading this, heed my warning. Never seek out the unknown, and if you ever wake up with strange markings on your skin, flee. Don't try to understand. Don't wait for answers. Just run and pray that the darkness isn't already watching. Leaving the library, I felt an intense urge to get out of Austin, away from these symbols. The idea was ridiculous. The thought of staying any longer felt unbearable. I drove for hours, my destination unclear. I only knew that I wanted to be somewhere empty, somewhere that didn't carry the weight of other people. Eventually, I found myself in Marfa, a small, desolate town known for its strange lights and eerie silence. By the time I arrived, dusk was settling in, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. I checked into a rundown motel, hoping a night in solitude might help clear my mind, but as soon as I closed my eyes, the darkness came alive. The symbols on my arms began to burn in intense, searing pain that spread through my veins, reaching into my very bones. I threw off the covers and flicked on the lights, heart pounding. Then I saw it, a faint glow seeping through the window blinds. Heart hammering, I peeled the blinds open just a sliver, and there in the distance I saw them, strange floating orbs of light. They danced in flickers, moving in unnatural patterns, hovering in the open desert beyond the town. My skin prickled with unease. These were the Marfa lights, a local phenomenon, but they seemed different. As I watched, I felt a compulsion to go outside and follow them, as if some unseen force was pulling me into the night. Despite every instinct telling me to stay put, I found myself drawn toward the lights, compelled by an urge that felt alien. I left the motel, stumbling through the brush, the lights glowing brighter the closer I got. I felt as though the world was melting around me, the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurring until they were indistinguishable. The lights continued to drift further, and I followed, tripping over rocks and stray branches, heedless of the pain. Finally, they led me to a clearing surrounded by twisted, gnarled trees that looked as though they'd been burned and scarred by some ancient fire. In the middle of this desolate place was an old, decrepit altar. Stone and weathered it bore the same symbols that marked my skin, and a nauseating realization hit me. This place, this altar, was connected to whatever was happening to me. Suddenly, I felt a presence, a heaviness pressing down on me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. A shadow detached itself from the surrounding darkness, shifting and morphing until it took on a vaguely human shape. I wanted to run to scream, but I was paralyzed, locked in place as this thing circled me. The creature moved closer, and as it did, I could feel its gaze upon me, probing, digging into my mind. It reached out a hand, bony and clawed, and traced the symbols on my arm. I felt the cold, so intense it burned. The creature's touch was like frostbite, leaching warmth from my very soul. A voice cold and hollow echoed in my mind. "You are marked, a beacon to the realm beyond." Once called, there's no escape. It vanished then as quickly as it appeared, leaving me alone in the darkness, with the pulsing pain of the symbols etched into my skin. I stumbled back to the motel, collapsing on the bed, drenched in sweat and trembling with terror. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature felt its presence lurking just beyond the edge of my mind. In the days that followed, I tried to return to normal life, but the symbols remained dark and unyielding. At night, the lights appeared outside my window closer, each time their glow sickly and unnatural. I realized they were not just lights. They were eyes watching, waiting for the moment to drag me fully into their world. As I sit here now, penning these last words, I know I don't have much time left. The lights are here again, right outside my window, flickering and pulsing. The symbols on my arms are burning, searing into my flesh as though demanding my surrender. If you're reading this, heed my warning. Never seek out the unknown. And if you ever wake up with strange markings on your skin, flee. Don't try to understand. Don't wait for answers. Just run and pray that the darkness isn't already watching. You've requested a deep dive into a chilling tale, a first-hand account that bleeds into reality. Today, we're venturing into the heart of Texas, to a forgotten town named Anderson's Crossing. It's a place where history seems to whisper on the wind, where shadows hold secrets, and where one family's day trip became a descent into a terrifying, inescapable nightmare. This isn't a ghost story for campfires. It's a tale that crept into my mind, settled in my bones, and twisted every corner of my reality. What I'm about to tell you isn't folklore or legend. This is exactly what happened. I wish I could explain why I chose Anderson's Crossing as our family day trip destination, but the truth is I don't know. I'd been hearing about this place from a coworker who swore by its unique charm. A piece of Texas history frozen in time, he'd said. It was late fall, a brisk November day. The kids had been restless for weeks. Maybe I was just itching to get us all out of the house. Maybe it was just curiosity that led me to Anderson's Crossing. Or maybe something darker, like the call of something waiting to be found. My wife, Leah, was hesitant. She'd heard stories about the place, tales people whispered about folks who visited, and never quite felt the same after they left. But I laughed it off. We piled into the car, armed with snacks and thermoses, and took the old road out of town. I'd heard the drive could be long, winding through barren fields and half-abandoned towns. But that day, it felt timeless. Each mile seemed to drag us deeper into a part of Texas I had never seen before, or maybe just never noticed. The first thing that struck me about Anderson's Crossing was the silence. There was a stillness there, an unyielding quiet that seemed to press in around us as we parked. I can still hear the hollow thud of the car doors closing as we stepped out, as though the place absorbed sound rather than letting it echo. That kind of silence can be unsettling. Have you ever experienced that? Being somewhere so quiet it almost feels wrong. It's true. And that feeling was amplified by the way the town looked. Picture this. Tall buildings with faded signs, some barely clinging to the brick, a crumbling church tower standing proudly at the end of Main Street, and the faint scent of something old and earthy in the air. It was quaint, but picturesque even. But there was an underlying wrongness to it all. And it wasn't just me. The kids felt it too. They were unusually quiet, clinging to Leah and me. Their little hands gripping ours tight, they seemed to sense something I couldn't quite grasp. Maybe you're right. We tried to shake off the unsettling feeling, to enjoy the day. We wandered through the mostly deserted streets, visiting the small, dusty museum, the old general store with its creaky floorboards and shelves stocked with forgotten goods. We even walked through the church, its heavy wooden doors groaning as if in protest. There was a strange allure to the place, a haunting beauty that seemed to pull you in like a moth to a flame. But beneath it all, there was that ever-present darkness, a weight I couldn't shake off, and that question, that doubt lingered long after we left Anderson's Crossing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long creeping shadows across the town, we piled back into the car and drove away. I remember glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching us leave. But there was nothing. Just the empty streets fading into the dusk and the unsettling feeling that we weren't truly alone. That night, the darkness of Anderson's Crossing followed me home. I tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling of unease that had settled deep in my gut. And then the dreams began. I found myself back on the streets of Anderson's Crossing, but it wasn't the quaint town we had visited. The buildings were twisted, grotesque, their once charming facades now rotting and crumbling. Shadows danced in the moonlight, taking on sinister shapes that seemed to writhe and coil just beyond my reach. And everywhere I felt eyes watching me, cold and unblinking. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. I looked over at Leah, and even in the darkness I could see the terror in her eyes. She had been dreaming too. The same nightmare, the same distorted version of Anderson's Crossing. It was more than just a shared dream. It was a shared terror. We tried to brush it off as a coincidence, result of our imaginations running wild after a creepy day trip. But as the days turned into weeks, the nightmares only intensified. They became more vivid, more oppressive, as if something was trying to pull us back to Anderson's Crossing. And the worst part was the kids started having the nightmares too. They would wake up screaming, their tiny faces contorted in fear, describing the same decaying town, the same menacing shadows. We tried to be rational. We tried to tell ourselves it was just stress, just bad dreams. But deep down we all knew something was wrong. Something had followed us home from that town. Something that was seeping into our lives, poisoning our sleep and twisting our reality. And then the nightmare spilled over into our waking hours. I started hearing footsteps in the house at night. Slow, deliberate footsteps. That seemed to follow me from room to room. Leah would wake up in the middle of the night convinced she saw shadowy figures lurking in the corners of our bedroom. One night I woke up to the sound of our youngest son crying. I went to check on him, and he was standing in the doorway of his room, his eyes wide with terror. He pointed a trembling finger down the hallway and whispered, "They're calling me. They want me to go back." My blood ran cold. It was no longer just nightmares. Whatever had latched onto us in Anderson's Crossing was reaching out, trying to pull us back to that forsaken town. The fear was crippling. It was like a virus spreading through our family, consuming us from the inside out. We tried everything to break free, sage smudging, prayer, even sleeping with the lights on, but nothing worked. The darkness of Anderson's Crossing had become a part of us. And then one night Leah had a vision. She wasn't asleep, but she wasn't fully awake either. She was in a trance. Her eyes glazed over, her body trembling uncontrollably. She saw herself back in Anderson's Crossing, alone. Lost in a maze of crumbling buildings, the shadows were closing in on her, whispering her name. Their voices like the rustle of dead leaves. They were beckoning her, promising her answers, promising her peace. Leah's vision was a breaking point. We couldn't ignore it any longer. We couldn't run from it. We had to go back to Anderson's Crossing. We had to confront whatever evil had latched onto us, whatever was calling us back to that desolate town. We had to face our nightmares head on. We drove back to Anderson's Crossing under a sky thick with storm clouds, the air heavy with a sense of foreboding. It was as if the town itself was bracing for our arrival, drawing in the darkness like a shroud. As we crossed the town, the feeling of oppression intensified, pressing down on us like a physical weight. The silence was even more profound this time, broken only by the mournful whistle of the wind. The building that had seemed quaintly dilapidated on our first visit now appeared skeletal, their empty windows like vacant eyes staring out at us. The church at the end of Main Street, once a symbol of hope and faith, now loomed over the town, like a twisted, gnarled finger pointing accusingly at the sky. We stopped the car in front of the church. This was the epicenter of our nightmares, the place where the shadows had whispered to Leah. Where my son had heard their call, I felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach, a primal instinct screaming at me to turn back to run. But I knew we couldn't escape. We had to face whatever awaited us within those decaying walls. The heavy wooden door creaked open, as if warning us to stay away. The air inside was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, a suffocating blanket of cold that seemed to cling to our skin. Dust motes danced in the faint shafts of light filtering through the grimy stained glass windows, casting distorted shadows that writhed on the floor like living things. We walked down the aisle, our footsteps echoing in the cavernous silence. I felt a presence here, a palpable weight in the air, a coldness that seemed to seep into my bones. And then, in the dim light filtering through a cracked window, I saw it, a figure standing in the shadows near the altar, tall and gaunt, shrouded in darkness. It seemed to emanate an aura of pure malice. I felt a surge of terror so intense it almost paralyzed me. I took a step forward, my voice a choked whisper. "Who are you?" The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching us, its silence more terrifying than any scream. And then, as if in response to my question, a cold wind swept through the church, extinguishing the candles and plunging us into darkness. In that moment, I felt something brush against me, a fleeting touch, cold and insubstantial like a spiderweb trailing across my skin, and then it was gone. We stumbled out of the church, blinded and disoriented. Back in the car, we huddled together, our breath coming in ragged gasps. We had seen it, felt it. The darkness that had haunted our dreams, that had followed us home from Anderson's Crossing, was real. It was a malevolent force, a presence that seemed to feed on our fear. We left Anderson's Crossing that day, but the experience left an indelible mark on our souls. The nightmares eventually faded, but the memory of that shadowy figure, the feeling of its cold touch, still lingers. And sometimes in the quiet moments, I wonder if we truly escaped the clutches of that desolate town, or if a part of us is still there, trapped in the shadows, waiting to be called back. Anderson's Crossing isn't just a place, it's a warning, a testament to the darkness that can lurk in the forgotten corners of our world, a darkness that can seep into our lives, our dreams, our very souls. It's a reminder that some places are best left undisturbed, their secrets buried deep within the shadows. You've always been drawn to the mysteries of the unknown, the stories whispered in hushed tones, the places people avoid. This deep dive takes you to a forgotten village hidden deep in the Texas wilderness, a place steeped in unsettling silence and shadows. We're venturing into a first-hand account of a weekend trip gone wrong, an exploration of the unsettling and unexplained. Get ready, listener, because this journey will stay with you long after the campfire's gone out. I've been hiking for as long as I can remember. There's something comforting about the solitude out in the wild, the kind of quiet that only exists far from civilization. I thought I knew the woods better than most, but I wasn't prepared for what we stumbled upon out there in Texas. It started as a simple weekend trip, just me and 3 friends. We wanted to explore a part of the Texas wilderness that wasn't on the regular maps, a place whispered about in hushed tones by locals who refused to go near it. I'd heard a story about an old village tucked far into the woods, long abandoned. My friend Matt, he's the one who brought it up. Something about finding ghosts from a forgotten time. I laughed it off as a silly legend. We set out early, hiking through thick forests. The canopy overhead blocked most of the sun, leaving an eerie twilight, even though it was midday. We'd been walking for hours, the chatter slowly dying down as we each began to feel the strange silence that seemed to thicken the air. I noticed odd things at first. Faint footprints in the dirt that didn't belong to any of us, branches that looked recently broken, almost like someone or something had passed through just before us. We reached the village by late afternoon. It was as though we'd stepped back in time. Wooden houses, weathered and gray, stood silently in rows, their windows dark and empty like the hollow eyes of long-forgotten ghosts. The silence was heavier there, pressing in from all sides, so complete it made my ears ring. But as we walked through, I noticed things that didn't fit. A recent fire smoldered in a pit outside one of the houses, embers still glowing. A meal half-finished sitting on a table as if the person eating it had been interrupted, maybe even scared off. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I looked around. "This place isn't empty," Matt said quietly, voicing what we were all thinking. "Someone's been here. Or maybe they still are." My friend Rachel found a journal in one of the houses. Its pages were filled with entries, scrawled in shaky handwriting. And the dates, they were recent. Some were from just days ago. The words were bizarre, scattered thoughts about the village, about people watching from the woods, figures that appeared only in glimpses. The writer talked about feeling eyes everywhere and hearing whispers at night that grew louder the longer they stayed.
What's fascinating here is that the journal acts as a bridge between the physical and the psychological. The recent dates tell us the village isn't simply abandoned, it's actively being interacted with. But the content of the entries, the feeling of being watched, the whispers these, suggest something beyond a physical presence. It's as if the village itself is sentient, exerting a kind of psychic pressure on its inhabitants.
That's a chilling thought, isn't it, listener? This isn't just about an abandoned village, it's about an unseen force that seems to be playing with the minds of those who enter it. Think about it. You find yourself in this isolated village, the silence pressing down on you, and then you stumble upon a journal filled with paranoid ramblings. How would you react? Would you dismiss it as the ravings of a madman, or start to question your own sanity? I can tell you, as I read those journal entries, a shiver ran down my spine. It felt real, too real. It was like the writer's fear was bleeding out of the pages and into me. I started to notice things I hadn't before. The way the shadows seemed to move even when the wind was still loosed. The way the houses creaked and groaned like something was moving inside them. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes on me watching my every move. The sun began to dip, and that's when things took a darker turn. Shadows lengthened, stretching and contorting, and the wind began to howl low through the trees, carrying with it faint voices. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that it was just the eeriness of the place getting to me. But then I saw it, or at least I thought I did. From the corner of my eye, a figure moved in the window of one of the houses. I turned heart racing, but it was gone, leaving only a cold emptiness behind. It wasn't just me. Rachel gasped, pointing at another house where she'd seen movement as well.
This is a classic element of hauntings and supernatural encounters, the fleeting glimpse, the movement seen in peripheral vision. It plays on our natural tendency to seek patterns and meaning, especially in situations where we feel vulnerable or out of control. But what's particularly unsettling here is that multiple witnesses are experiencing these fleeting visions. This suggests something more than just individual imagination at play.
It was like the village itself was breathing, pulsing with a life that none of us could see. By nightfall, we decided to camp outside the village, but even as we left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The night brought a chill that seeped into my bones, the air filled with sounds I couldn't identify. Soft murmurs, the rustling of leaves, footsteps. It was like the village itself was breathing, pulsing with a life that none of us could see.
This is where the narrative takes on a more sinister tone. It's not just the environment that's unsettling, but the experiences of the individuals start to unravel. The line between shared experience and individual delusion becomes increasingly blurred.
And let me tell you, listener, that blurring is terrifying. One by one, strange things began happening to each of us. Matt swore he felt a hand on his shoulder, icy and claw-like, yet there was no one there when he turned. Evan claimed he saw lights moving in the distance, bobbing and swaying like lanterns, leading deeper into the woods. I'd always thought Evan was the rational one, the grounded one. But the look on his face was pure terror. Then something happened that rattled us all to the core. Rachel disappeared. One moment she was right there, standing beside me, her flashlight illuminating the trees. The next she was gone, her light abandoned in the dirt. We called out for her, our voices echoing through the emptiness. No answer. Nothing but the oppressive, deafening silence. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time didn't make sense anymore. We split up, each taking a different direction to look for her. But every path I took seemed to lead me back to the same spot. I'd seen those trees before that exact patch of ground. The village was twisting itself around us, trapping us in a labyrinth that couldn't escape.
The disorientation you described is a crucial detail. It suggests that the village isn't simply a physical location, but a kind of pocket reality, perhaps. A place where the normal laws of space and time don't apply. This aligns with folklore surrounding certain haunted locations, places said to exist on the border between worlds.
Eventually I heard her voice faint and distant, calling for help. I ran crashing through the underbrush, my flashlight flickering every nerve on edge. But when I found her, I stopped cold. She was standing alone in the middle of the village, her face pale, her eyes wide and unseeing. Her lips moved as she mumbled incoherently, her voice barely more than a whisper. She didn't respond to me, didn't seem to notice I was even there, and when I touched her shoulder, she recoiled as if my touch had burned her. "Rachel," I whispered, my voice shaking. "What happened?" She looked at me, but it was like she was seeing something else. "They're still here," she said, her voice hollow, "watching, waiting for us to leave."
This moment is pivotal. Rachel's return in this altered state confirms that the village's influence is more than just psychological. Something has touched her, changed her. The question is what? And why allow her to return at all? Is it a warning? A manipulation?
The night stretched on, every second filled with the suffocating weight of unseen eyes. My skin prickled with the sensation that something was standing just behind me, breathing down my neck. I turned again and again, but there was nothing there. At least, nothing I could see. By dawn, I couldn't take it anymore. My mind was unraveling, splintering under the weight of the silence and the darkness pressing in from all sides. The village seemed to close in around us, the houses shifting their hollow windows, watching, judging. We had to get out. I grabbed Matt and Evan, practically dragging them away from the center of the village. Rachel followed, but she was different, as if something inside her had broken and couldn't be fixed. The path back felt endless. The forest was darker than it had been before, and the silence. It was too much. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was following us. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, moving just beyond the reach of the light. At some point I dared to look back. There, between the trees, I saw them, figures standing in silence, their forms blurred, half hidden in the mist. They weren't human, not entirely. Their faces were wrong, twisted in unnatural ways, their eyes blank and empty. They watched us, their expressions frozen, waiting.
This is a brilliant use of negative space. By describing what the figures are not, you heighten the sense of the unknown, the uncanny. It allows the listener's imagination to fill in the gaps, making the experience even more terrifying. It's the things we don't see that truly haunt us.
Finally, we stumbled out of the forest, the sunlight blinding and harsh after the oppressive darkness. We made it back to the car, drove away as fast as we could. But even as the miles stretched between us and that cursed village, a part of me stayed behind, trapped in that labyrinth of silence and shadows.
This lingering feeling, the sense of not being fully back, it's a common thread in accounts of encounters with the otherworldly. It's as if a part of your soul has been touched, marked by the experience. And sometimes that mark doesn't fade.
It hasn't faded for me, listener. It hasn't faded for any of us. Rachel wouldn't talk about it, and neither would Matt or Evan. But I could see it in their eyes, that same haunted look that I knew was reflected in my own. Since then, I can't go a day without thinking of it. I still feel their eyes, those cold, unfeeling eyes watching from the shadows. Some nights I wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, convinced I can hear whispers just outside my window. And when I look, sometimes I swear I see them shadowy figures standing still watching.
What's striking is that the experience hasn't ended with the physical departure from the village. The psychological effects, the nightmares, the feeling of being watched, suggest a continued presence and attachment. It raises the question, Did you escape the village, or did something follow you home?
That's a question that haunts me, listener. And I think it's a question that should haunt you too. Because this isn't just a story, it's a warning. A reminder that there are places in this world where the veil between reality and nightmare is thin. Places where the things we can't see are the ones that hold the most power over us. So be careful where you wander, listener. And if you ever find yourself in a place that feels wrong, a place that whispers to the primal fears within you, turn back before it's too late.